Okay.
Right. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you all here once again and continue with our shiurim on themes in Sefer Bereshis. We were in the middle, actually, if you remember last week's shir, I dedicated half of it to the yard site of Rabbi Sachs and gave you a little bit of a taste of some of his amazing contribution to our generation. And I'd just like to reiterate what I said at the end of the shir last time, that we should, for those people who read books, by all means read his books, but not everybody's into reading philosophical books. Nowadays, if you go onto YouTube and just type in Rabbi Sachs, you get some amazing talks of his, which are really inspirational and worth listening to. Some of you might know what are TED Talks, TED Talks. He gave a TED Talk a few years ago, and it had over 2 million people watched it. It was considered to be facing the future without fear. And he had a way of really tapping into the modern mind and the modern world and bringing in real Torah values of emunah and Yerushalayim and family life, and in a most remarkable and unique way. And that was the first half of the shir last week. The second half of the shir, we got into the next topic in Sefer Bereshis was Migdal Bovel, which is Bereshis chapter 11, a very fascinating and quite, I would say, enigmatic topic. When you read the Chumash, it's not entirely clear. It's not clear what was the Aveira and what was the Onesh. Not entirely clear what exactly happened there. It's all over in 9 psukim, and the Torah doesn't actually explain it. But we do find in the Mefarshim something very, very fascinating. And I was reminded actually of our shir on Migdal Bovel. A friend of mine last week spoke to me. He'd just come back from Dubai. And apparently in Dubai is the tallest building in the world, something called the Burj. The Burj is the most unbelievable building in the world, more than half a mile high, and costing billions and attracting millions of people every year. And it was actually, and when you read the story about why it was built, you hear about why it was built, it sounds very much like Migdal Bovel. In other words, it was built just in order to show power and pride and in many ways just to show people we are the most powerful people in the world, right? The Dubai, the United Arab Emirates have got massive, incredible, almost incalculable wealth, and they wanted to build a building which showed the world, we are not peasants living in the desert. We are the most powerful nation in the world financially, and they built this building. I thought it was very fascinating. Here's the Torah recording events happening 4,000 years ago, and suddenly here we have still today, people are building skyscrapers for purposes of self-aggrandizement and arrogance in a certain sense, to show how fantastic. They don't build the skyscraper because they're short of land to build horizontally. They just built it to show that they can, that they have the money and the power and the technology, and that they rule the world in a certain sense. It's I think when you and I grew up, I'm speaking to most of the people here this year, and the highest building in the world was the Empire State Building. Some of you might remember Empire State Building. Go and visit New York, get to the top of the Empire State Building. You're the highest point in Earth which has become habitable. But now, I think this building is twice the size of the Empire State Building, and it's got apartments and hotels and restaurants at the highest spot in the world. Why is that important? The answer is it isn't important. The answer is it's completely irrelevant, really, but it's a statement of pride. And this is really in the story of Migdal Bovel, human hubris, in a certain sense. Hubris means arrogant self-pride, because doesn't mean pride in the positive sense of the word. Of course, everybody has to be proud of themselves and of their beliefs and their family and what they belong to. That this is pride which is supremely arrogant and overbearing. And this was the story of Migdal Bavel, and it's all contained really in see if I can find. Okay, you have to bear with me, Rabbi Isai, for 1 second. Just have to get. Try that again. Share the screen. There we go. Yes, the screen. Yes, see a text. Okay. So in this text, so the pasuk says, just to remind you, this in a sense was the key pasuk that we ended with in the last shia. The pasuk says here, "Vayomru hava nivne lanu ir umigdal, v'rosho b'shamayim," a tower which has its head in the heavens, right? And if you look at this Burj in Dubai, you will see that's exactly what it is. It looks like it's got its head in the heavens. And what's the objective of it? The objective is v'naseh lanu sheim. V'naseh lanu sheim. We're going to make for ourselves a name, right? We're going to make ourselves the most powerful and dominant nation in the world. Now, at that time in the world, there weren't so many people. It was a few generations after Noach. One imagines there might have been a few thousands or a few tens of thousands of people on planet Earth. But the Migdal Bavel was an attempt to make everybody part of one nation and, more importantly, one affiliation, one belief system. And what's interesting is that you might have thought that actually unity is something good. Look at the opening pasuk of Migdal Bavel. Sounds quite good. Vahi kol haaretz sofo achas udvarim achodim. Everybody spoke the same language, but more importantly is dvarim achodim. Udvarim achodim. So we'll see in a minute. If you look in the a very interesting statement made by the Netziv, Hamek Dava. And it's interesting because the Netziv was living at a time, right, we're talking about the second half of the 19th century. The Netziv was living at a time where the idea of communism was already beginning, was starting. They hadn't had a communist revolution yet, didn't start until the early 20th century. But he already knew about communism and the idea of a communist state. So he says here, what does it mean, Devorim Achodim, says the Netziv. So he's writing, if you like, 120 years ago, Lo bi'er hakosuv hadvorim elo beremes. He says this whole parsha in the Torah is not bi'ur, it's not explained, it's all beremes. It's all only mentioned in very slight metaphors, as we find in the Medrash. The Torah doesn't explain what were these Devarim Achodim, what were the ideas that united everybody. So he says it must be, when the Torah is telling us, it doesn't actually matter what ideas united everybody. What's important is that everybody was united in one thought pattern. Everybody was united in one idea. And here's an interesting thought, just for a minute. We tend to think that unity is a fantastic goal in life, that everybody should be united together and joined together, etc. The story of Migdal Bavel is a story where the Torah is giving us a very important value statement, and that is that actually variety and disunity has very important value, is a very important value in life. That we should welcome diversity. We should welcome diversity. This is not such a simple idea. Most people who have a thought have a value system and they believe in something, they also firmly believe that everybody else should believe in it. And if they don't, then they are absolutely wrong and that they should be punished for it in some way, right? It's a very strange thing that concept used to come, sometimes comes from what's called right-wing policies, right? Like Yamach Shimon, the Nazi party, if it didn't tolerate any dissenters, no Germans were allowed to dissent with the Nazi party. No one was allowed to disagree with it. If they did, they were killed. And it also comes from the left, from the Communist Party. Also there, they didn't tolerate any dissenters. In other words, the regime was a totalitarian regime in the thought sense. You weren't allowed to think thoughts other than the ones that the government or the ruling party or the king considered valuable. If you thought something else, then you would be killed, right? And that, says the Netziv, is what this part. So Netziv has got a very interesting angle on this. This story of the Migdal Bavel is a story about totalitarianism. It was the first example of totalitarianism, and this was someone called Nimrod. Right? Nimrod only appears once in the Chumash about he was a Gibor Chaya. That's all the Torah says about Nimrod. But actually, Chazal tell us that Nimrod was the chief villain of the time and the chief opponent of Avraham Avinu. So at that time, the two giants who were fighting each other, not on the battleground, but fighting each other ideologically, was Nimrod at one end of the spectrum and Avraham Avinu at the other end of the spectrum. Right? Nimrod, I remember a case, just as a footnote here, I remember a case many years ago. This goes back many, many years, my yeshiva days. I'm afraid to say that's probably about 50 years ago, in some of my yeshiva days, at a bris, and the moil there was one of the old Yerushalmi moils, and it was a completely non-religious family. Somebody who I knew was a friend of a friend. It was a completely non-religious bris. And you know what happens at a bris? The moil says, gives a bracha, v'yikarei shemo b'Yisrael, and the father said, Nimrod. The father said to the moil, we want to call our baby Nimrod. So he put the baby down, and he said, no, I'm not going to call any Jewish baby Nimrod. That's it. Nimrod is not a name that I'm going to give to a Jewish neshama. The name, apparently Nimrod in Israel today, I wouldn't say it's popular, but it's certainly an acceptable name. Israelis call boys Nimrod. I think there's a famous Israeli football player, I was told, called Nimrod. But in actual fact, in Chazal, it's like calling somebody Haman, right? I mean, it's a name which has so many negative associations in classical Jewish sources. Even though in the Chumash itself, it just says he was a Gibor Chayil, that he was a warrior king. But actually, Chazal tell us that he was an arch Rasha, and he tried to kill Avraham Avinu. He threw Avraham Avinu into the furnace. The way Chazal describe it is that they had massive furnaces burning in order to make bricks, to build massive skyscraper buildings. And any dissenters were thrown into these furnaces. And Avraham Avinu was a dissenter. He did not accept the Avodah Zarah of Nimrod. At the end of the day, Nimrod was promoting a pagan way of life. But what was interesting here wasn't what the Netziv is saying, is something very interesting. The issue isn't so much what the people of the Haflaga believed in. The important thing here was that they enforced a totalitarian sort of unity, that no one was allowed to think differently. And I think one of the beautiful, coming back to Rabbi Sachs for a minute, I remember Rabbi Sachs used to speak frequently on the topic of how beautiful it is that anybody who opens even one page of the Gemara is struck immediately by diversity of opinions. In the Mishnahs, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, they are discussing. In the Gemara is Abaye Barava, and then you have Rashi and Tosfos. Then you have, on one page of Gemara, you have generation after generation of what? Of diversity of views. And it's a diversity of views which is actually important in Talmud Torah. No Talmud Torah is monolithic. It's never made. Monolithic literally means one stone. That's what it means. Monolithic. It's never all made of one piece. You always have different strands and different thoughts. And the beauty, and one of the incredibly inspirational aspects of Torah learning, as opposed to maybe studying other religious texts, other religions tend to have texts which are very dogmatic. This is our dogma. This is what we believe in. Everybody who believes in this will be saved. Everybody who dissents is damned. Right? That is the nature generally of religious texts. And that's why people coming from other religions and studying Talmud become very confused. How can you have a religious text with dozens of dissenting opinions? And everyone's got different ideas about how it works. And somehow the Torah is encouraging human diversity, right? That human diversity, different of opinions, different ideas, is welcomed. Having said that, it's interesting to note that actually, of course, the Torah does welcome different ideas, but it does have a core center of beliefs in Emunah, in God, believes in Torah min Hashamayim. The 13 Ani Mamin principles of the Ramba was a very interesting document, because the 13 Ani Mamin principles of the Ramba was the first time anybody actually had written down Jewish dogma. Before the Rambam wrote his 13 Ani Ma'amin principles, nobody had ever really articulated what are the, if you like, immovable principles of Torah. Even though it's implicit, all these Ani Ma'amin principles, as is the case with most of what the Rambam writes. Most of what the Rambam writes are not his own chidushim, only he has given them structure. The Rambam takes a page of Gemara with 10 different opinions and arguments for and against one thing or another, and he gives you one paragraph, which is really a summary of what's going on, so that you can come away with it with something clear. So the Rambam gives us clarity out of diversity, right? So also in Jewish philosophy, not only in halacha, but Jewish philosophy as well, the Rambam takes hundreds of remarks and ideas in the Mishnah and the Gemara, and he says, right, I can boil this down to 13 Ani Ma'amin principles, right? Principles: belief in God, belief in the oneness of God, belief in our prayer to God, belief in the Torah min Hashamayim, belief in Olam Haba and reward and punishment and Mashiach. These are actually not negotiable principles. So I think it's wrong to say that in the Torah there is endless, if you like, diversities of views. The Torah has got a core of accepted views, and if you diverge from that, then you are what the Mishnah and Sanhedrin calls an apikoros, right? The idea of an apikoros, of course, comes from the Greek philosopher who was called Epicurus. There was a Greek philosopher called Epicurus who didn't believe in anything that couldn't be seen or touched or measured, and anything other than the physical world. He had a belief that all spiritual ideas were fantasies and that all that existed was the physical world, and he became the classic Epicurus, right? An Epicurean way of thinking. And Chazal used this word regularly, the Epicurus, as someone who denied the basics. But once you've got the basic beliefs in Torah and Emunah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then the rest of Torah welcomes diversity. And in actual fact, that's why are rabbis always disagreeing with each other? Right? Some of you might have noticed that, right? Rabbis rarely sit down together and all sign off on one statement. If you ever see, incidentally, a statement signed off by lots and lots of rabbis, you can be sure that it's fake. That it's fake. And that indeed, I've actually challenged on several occasions in my life. I have seen sort of notices signed off by 20 rabbanim, and I happen to know 2 or 3 of them. And I made it my business to actually speak to 2 or 3 of them and say, why did you sign this document? And in many cases, they said, I didn't. They just took my name and put it on the poster. I never signed this. I would never have signed this, right? But now that his name is on the poster, for him to make a public statement disowning the poster, that's already a radical thing to do. He'll get himself into hot water if he does that. And that's what people are relying upon. So in actual fact, a lot of these posters and notices allegedly signed off, allegedly by lots of rabbanim, are fake. They're simply, it's like fake news. All it needs is one guy in a printing shop, and he can type off some names of people who he thinks pretty much probably, not that they will agree with this, but they won't have the guts to publicly disagree with it, right? And he can put their names up on a poster. So this is just a general health warning. In general, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to warn you, we have to be a little bit skeptical about posters and notices, generally speaking. If a poster and notice says something which seems a bit strange, the answer is it is strange. And it's been simply been put up by strange people, and they have put even sadly, even up to and including hechsher notices. There have been recently a proliferation of fake hechsher notices. You have to read a tudat hechsher has to be read very carefully, and you have to look at it. And on a few occasions, I've taken a picture of it and sent it to people who I know, and they said, "This is bogus. There is no such organization. There is no such rabbi. This is just somebody with a printer. Nowadays, with a laptop and a color printer, you can make any tudah you like, with all sorts of decorations and all sorts of frum-looking words on it. Sadly, we are in a situation of a lot of fake. Also, incidentally, quite a few of these seeming hechsherim don't actually say that this ducts. He's not giving a hechsher to the restaurant. In other words, he doesn't know. He's never been in the kitchen once in his life. He is completely. So all I'm saying is, how did I come to this? Because when you have lots of people agreeing on a particular notice, the chances are that this is fake. And the original story of unity and disunity, and unity which is being used not for good purposes, is the Migdal Bavel. This has become the, if you like, the landmark in the Torah for the idea of a totalitarian society. And we are now living in a totalitarian society coming from the left. If anybody gets up nowadays publicly and suggests that global warming is a myth, or maybe it's not such a great idea to lead a gay and lesbian life, he gets completely clobbered worldwide by millions of organizations. How dare you say something like that? It's impossible, a terrible thing to say. It's completely unacceptable because it doesn't fit in with the politically correct leftness, left-wing policies. You're not allowed to have a different view on it at all. And that, in a sense, is also a revival of a totalitarian way of thinking coming from the left, right? Often it comes from the right, sometimes it comes from the left, but whatever it is, it's all Migdal Bavel. And the Netziv says, all this is contained, I think this is very beautiful, let's go back to the text a second. All this is contained in this word in the Torah, where it says, Devarim Achodim. Can you see this? Devarim Achodim. What does Devarim Achodim literally mean? Devarim Achodim means achid means united, all of one, all the same. But they all were thinking the same. So he says here, the Torah doesn't say what they were thinking. Right? The Torah just says, Ki'im shahayu dvarim achadim. All it says is that they were all united, or all were thinking they knew. And it comes to teach us, says the Netzir, the loy mishum hadvarim is ore HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't come down and destroy the Migdal and disperse them into different nations because of the content of their thoughts. Ki'im bishvil shahayu achadim. Rather because they were all united in a way that they didn't tolerate any dissenting views. That's the point, right? You, Masha, you. Doesn't even matter what their thoughts are. If they don't accept diversity, that is dangerous for the future of mankind. And then he goes on to say, I don't know what happened to my text here for a second. And then he goes on to say, he says, at first sight, what's wrong with people being united? It's lovely, everybody thinking the same thing. But Adarabba, he says, on the contrary, whatever that means. But he says, Avul Khan Gorab Lachsho Dava, Sheyetze Letakolas Hayisha. Here, this was Letakalat Hayisha. Now, if you have if takala means a fault, right? This will be a fault in mankind. If you have mankind united around any ideology in a way that doesn't give room for diversity, right? Then human beings will feel completely strangled and unable to be creative and thinking, and that was the chetzer of Migdal Bavel. So actually, we have a combination of ideas here. The first thing was an exaggerated sense of pride and arrogance, building a skyscraper to the heavens like the one in Dubai. But the other side of it was that they enforced thought police. They enforced a totalitarian society. So he says, let's understand this properly. What were they worried about? That people would go elsewhere. This was part of their way of thinking. Deos base aleph means b'nei adam. Ein deos b'nei adam shavit. People have a tendency to think differently. Independent-minded people have their own thoughts. They were worried that people will dissent, people will disagree with them and have different views. That's why they didn't want people to leave their settlement. Because they made a big town and a fence around the town with police. No one was allowed to leave. Why weren't they allowed to leave? Because if they left, they could then develop independent ideas. So they had, this was, he says, the totalitarian society of thousands of years ago. Anybody who deviated from the agreed upon belief, he says, they threw him into the furnace. Kasha osu la aleph aleph. Okay, these are, you have to get used to the abbreviations of Hebrew. Who is Aleph Aleph here? So Aleph here is Avraham Avinu. You have to be careful though with Aleph Aleph. Aleph sometimes means Efshar, sometimes it means Ashes Ish, sometimes it means Avraham Avinu. So you have to be careful though with abbreviations. Here definitely it means like they did to Avraham Avinu. Kimche says, in summary, the united thoughts among them, which at first sight seems like a good idea, a society based on a shared way of thinking, but it became a ro'etz, means it became a weapon. They decided to kill anybody who didn't agree with this. It's quite a sort of prediction in a certain way the Netziv has here, and a beautiful interpretation of this particular parsha, and one of the principles of Sefer Bereshis. How's my internet connection, Elio? Am I doing okay on the internet connection? You can hear me? Okay?
Yes, there's been a little bit of disruption, but generally speaking, it's going smoothly.
Okay, thank you. I'm getting a bit of a blurred picture occasionally, but now I think it's stable again. It's interesting, actually. Nowadays, the tendency to become to get people all to think the same thing, the tendency not to engage in the diversity of opinions has been greatly strengthened by the internet and by the Google and Facebook. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but if you look up certain articles in Google or in Facebook on a particular topic, let's say you've got, I don't know, right-wing views on Israel, right? So then Google develops an algorithm that this man is interested in right-wing views, and all the articles that it suggests and sends to you all support your view. So in actual fact, a person who is looking on his phone for a variety of different articles or statements or events won't get them, because the algorithm locks you in to what has been decided that you're interested. So if you're interested in a particular topic, you will always get reinforced in your views, and you can go through your whole life never hearing or reading an article which presents a different view. And of course, this only tends to strengthen everybody in their views, and therefore anybody who thinks differently is an enemy. Anybody who thinks differently is terrible. Right? This is happening a lot in universities nowadays as well. If a professor gets up and gives a view which is not in the, if you like, accepted, politically correct structure of events, then he can be fired. He'll be fired from his job. It used to be the case that universities were places for independent thinking and for experiencing a variety of different views and thoughts in order to make up your own mind and be stimulated. But that's slowly becoming less the case than it used to be. And that's and all this comes back to Migdal Bava. So I mentioned to you in the beginning, when we were beginning to study themes in Sefer Bereshis, Bereshis deals with the fundamentals of human nature, right? The Cain and Hevel and the Chet Adam Harishon and Migdal Bava, the fundamental of these, they weren't just events that happened so many thousand years ago. This is actually built into human nature. Somebody just texted me, right, on pro and anti-vaccination, that if somebody voices an anti-vaccination view, he's absolutely demonized by society. Such a person, it used to be the case that one was allowed to have a view. Do you think it's a good idea? Well, it's not such a good idea. Nowadays, anybody who has an anti-vaccination view, which personally I think is stupid, but if spread a view, and the same goes for now they've got this global warming conference going on in Scotland. If anybody gets up and says, well, I think I've looked at the evidence and I think global warming is actually a big mistake, and that it's not really true at all, and that somebody wrote an article, I remember many years ago, there was a very big issue in environmental studies about the hole in the ozone layer. There's an ozone layer around the world, and there's a hole in it, a big hole in it. And they blamed the hole in the ozone layer on all sorts of pollution and aerosols, until one scientist showed there was evidence that there had always been a hole in the ozone layer, and that the Earth needs a hole in the ozone layer to let heat escape from the Earth's atmosphere, and that the hole in the ozone layer is a permanent feature of planet Earth. And since then, nobody's ever heard about a hole in the ozone layer. But for many, many years, that was considered to be the greatest sign of the destruction of pollution. So it's very, very hard to know. Very, very hard to know how to evaluate evidence. But in today's world, the accepted view, which is enforced in all universities and all governments and all the media, is that pollution is creating global warming, and that the only solution to it is to lessen the pollution. But if someone voices the view that maybe this evidence is not correct, and maybe it doesn't create global warming, is considered to be, they throw him into the furnace, right? It's unacceptable. One has to be very careful in thinking, which is designed to make sure that we are all marching to the same beat and no one's allowed to step out of line. And this was really a very fascinating message that the Torah is giving us from the very beginning. And that after Migdal Bavel, the world was divided up into different nations, different languages and different cultures. And the different languages, different cultures couldn't communicate with each other, and they couldn't speak to each other. This is before Google Translate, you understand? And they couldn't share their ideas with each other. And the Torah is telling us that actually, even though on one level you think that's not good, but actually in terms of the well-being of mankind, this is an asset. This is an asset for mankind to encourage diversity. I'm still got Rabbi Sachs on my mind. I can't forget the one time he wrote a book which was a problem. Anyone remember him writing a book, a problematic book, right? He wrote a book called The Dignity of Difference. Anybody remember that? The Dignity of Difference. And in it, he was speaking about this topic, the Migdal Bavel, and the diversity of views, and how it's important to have different views and how we need to respect other people's views. But in that book, he went a little bit overboard, right? And made a few statements which were unacceptable from a Torah point of view. I'm not going to go into it now, but I was a little bit involved in it at the time. And I remember at the time, I actually read the book, and I sent Rabbi Sachs an email where I think it was 23 different quotations in the book, which I had highlighted, which I sent in the email with page references in inverted commas, telling him these are statements which an Orthodox rabbi shouldn't be making. He was not happy with me at the time. We didn't fall out over it because he understood where I was coming from and I understood where he was coming from. But eventually, Baruch Hashem, there was a real crisis. And do you guys remember this? Phil, do you remember this whole drama? Yes?
Absolutely.
Yes? At the time, there was a whole drama about it. And Rabbi Sachs was even considering resigning as chief rabbi over this book because he was getting very seriously criticized by the entire United Synagogue Rabbinate, who are basically his rabbonim. So it's intolerable that our chief rabbi should write a book in which he writes these things. And in the end, he did something very clever. His solution was a product of his modesty. I mentioned it to you last time. One of the remarkable things of Rabbi Sachs was that even when he became a world celebrity, he still maintained an inner modesty, right? So he decided, instead of resigning and fighting and one thing and another, he's going to rewrite the book. He's going to retract. And it takes a certain amount of guts and modesty to put a book out there published. And then the second edition of the book was different. You can't buy anymore the second edition of the book, the first edition of the book. The first edition of the book has become a collector's item. Have a look in your library, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a copy of the first printing of The Dignity of Difference, it's worth a lot of money because there aren't many of them around, because they were sidelined, because in the second printing was already all those mistakes that he'd made were really adjusted and omitted, and the book still reads very beautifully without them. He made his point perfectly. His point is the point that we're discussing today in this share: the dignity of difference, to respect diversity among people, that if there are groups of people who think differently to you, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. There are people who are Hasidishers, and there are people who are Chilonim, and there are people who are Dati Le'umi, and there are people who've got these views and those views and right wing and left wing, and that's fine. That's good. We can have differences of opinion, and those differences of opinion only really show the depth and the breadth of the human mind and the human creativity, and it's something positive. And as I said before, it appears on every Daf Gemara, even every page of the Mikros Gedolos. You've got a posuk at the top, and then you've got 10 different Mefarshim all saying that this posuk means something different. You know, you've got Rashi and Ibn Ezra and the Ramban and the Rambam and the Rashbam, and all of them have got a different take on the posuk. How can you have that? Right? And the answer is that Talmud Torah is designed to develop our mind to the nth degree by giving us diversity of views. However, in that book, Dignity of Difference, he overstepped the mark, and he started speaking about diversity of views also in those areas which I mentioned before, which are the core beliefs of Klal Yisrael. The core beliefs of Klal Yisrael about God and Emunah and Olam Haba and about the Torah and Hashamayim and the Nevi'im. The core beliefs, those are not negotiable, right? But beyond that, we have to respect the difference, dignity of difference. But that book showed how easy it is to confuse diversity with something else. There is something else which is called pluralism. See, once you get into pluralism is a very dangerous area of the last 50 years in intellectual life. Does anyone know what pluralism means? Pluralism is is different to diversity. Diversity means I've got one neighbor who's a Hindu, one neighbor who's a Muslim, or one neighbor who's Chiloni, or one neighbor who's a Gerach Chassid, and I get on very nicely with them. We function together as fellow human beings, and we share what we can share, and what we disagree upon, that's fine. That is called diversity, and that's called tolerance. Pluralism means something else completely. Pluralism means I believe what I'm saying is true, but that's just my view. That's just my view of things. I also believe that what you're saying is true. In other words, everybody is true. There is no pluralism says there is no objective truth. There are no objective truths. There are only what they call in the postmodern world. There are only narratives. Somebody comes up to speak to a postmodern thinker, and you talk to him about your belief in God. You say, that's very interesting. You'll say, that's your narrative. Now, let me tell you my narrative. Everyone's got a different narrative, and there are no truths. And therefore, there's no emes, and therefore there's no sheker. And that's pluralism. Pluralism means we're all in this together. And if I believe in morality, and I've got a neighbor who is a cannibal and believes in eating other people, So he's got his truth and I've got my truth. And who's to say that my culture is better than his culture? And it's an abandoning of any objective criteria of truth and morality. That's pluralism. And to move from tolerance to pluralism is very, very easy. And Rabbi Sachs often actually later on, he often spoke about this as one of the big dangers of the 21st century, is to confuse tolerance, which is a positive quality, with pluralism. And in pluralism, we are lost because we have no values anymore. We don't know anymore what is true, what isn't true. We're accepting everybody's truth as just another version of truth. Coming relevant to Migdal Bavel. Migdal Bavel was a moment in history where everybody got together and decided we are going to run a totalitarian regime. Everybody has to think the same, believe the same, and as a result of which, we're going to try and make sure no one leaves the country, no one leaves the city, and start something new. HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided that the future of mankind needs diversity, and therefore they were divided up into 70 nations. Okay. Some reason I've lost my text. Bear with me for 1 second. Don't know why. We go. Okay. Okay, it's back up. Right. And there's also an interesting thing here by the Abarbanel. I think this is here. Yes, the Abarbanel. I don't often bring you the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel was writing in Spain about 500 years ago. And Abarbanel is one of the most original thinkers in his commentary on the Torah. If you want to appreciate diversity of opinions and new innovative ideas in the Torah, all within the framework of the principles of Emunah, you get the Abarbanel, a very, very creative and interesting writer and thinker. He actually lived through the expulsion from Spain. He survived the expulsion from Spain, even though the king and queen who expelled the Jews from Spain, they wanted him to stay because he was running the economy of the whole of Spain. But he decided he's going to accompany the Jews into exile from Spain. He couldn't remain. But his commentaries are very, very interesting and often unique. Anyhow, so here he says, let's have a look at the Abarbanel for a minute. So we find what was the Aveira of that generation of the Dar HaFloga, meaning the Migdal Bavel, Domeh Lechet Adam of Kain Ubanov. And it's a continuation of the story of Adam's Chet and Kain v'Hevel, Lefi shebios lehem ribui hu'inyonim hativim ha'hechrechim lekiyuma. They had a ribui. In other words, the world was extremely affluent and giving, and they were able to live in a way which didn't require from them any efforts at all. So they were living an effortless life in a world that gave naturally all the necessities of life. Me'eis Hashem min hashamayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them a gift. He put them in a world where they were living for hundreds of years, and they had they were able to earn to get their food and housing with very little effort. And then biyosom penuyim mimelacha mikol omer, because they had too much free time on their hands. B'li omer, they had no work to do. Umuchonim lisasek b'shleimus nafsham, and therefore they got involved in shleimus nafsham, their own personal development, as it was simply a result of of affluence. Lo nocho daito, they weren't satisfied with all the benefits that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had given them, harachva hativis, which was the natural bounty of the world, the yivakshu lishloach yod. They eventually decided lasim kol machshavosam limtza hamlochos bivnos iya shekaleles hamlochos kulam amigdal b'secho kadei niskaber sham v'lasas atzmon medinim tachas hayosam b'nei hasadeh. So this is a very interesting anthropological statement of the Abarbanel. What happens is, look at this last line here, right? What does mediniyim mean? So mediniyim means this was a transition, he said, from agricultural life to city life. Mediniyim means political life. They start, the Abarbanel says that the Migdal Baba was the beginning of politics. Until then, everybody had a massive, beautiful, their own fields, they grew their food, they lived, they ate, they had families, they enjoyed life, they enjoyed each other's company, and there was no politics, right? So the Ramba now has got a bit of a different angle than the Nativ. The Nativ says it's about a totalitarian state, but the Ramba says no, it's much more basic than that. Before you get to a totalitarian state, you get to a political system. Politics means who's in power, who's making the decisions, who has the authority to tell other people what to do and how to live. It was the beginning. He decided is chaber sham lasos atzmon mediniyim, to make themselves political, tachas hayosam b'nei sodeh, instead of being agricultural. He says this was the minute they started to become political, that was the beginning of a difficult time. So mankind lived in a state of perfect health, longevity, and abundance of good. Instead of using their time to increase their wisdom, it is political. That was the beginning, and to focus on creating social status and political power and state building. That is the Abarbanel. Now, of course, it's interesting because the Abarbanel himself was very involved in politics and in state building and in financing wars of the Spanish kingdom and the Spanish court, and borrowing and lending money. And he was a brilliant financier. And he understood politics, and he understood the dangers of politics. So he says here, this is all the Abarbanel, they thought they thought that the actual goal of mankind was to make a political unity in order to create a unified society. And this was the goal of mankind. Hashemos, v'haminuyim, v'hamemshalos, v'hakvodos, hadimyonios. The result was they invented all sorts of titles. You know, this fellow was the minister for this and the minister for that, and somebody else had a different. It's very interesting here how he describes the beginning of political life. Haminuyim, minuyim means appointments to be in charge of the land, being in charge of the produce, being in charge of the building, right? And he says, "V'hakavodos hadimyonios," the imagined covered, v'chemdas asifas hakinyami, and people amassing great wealth. Before that, people lived an agricultural life. Nobody amassed great wealth. They weren't interested, right? They were in planting, plowing, planting, and harvesting the field, getting harvests, and enjoying life. Suddenly, they shifted into political life, and it was a question of wealth and power, and who controls the wealth and power. And the result was, he says, "Ba'chomos, ba'hagezel, u'shvichas domim hanimshachim." And the result was violence and crime. So this is the way in which that's really what I wanted to share with you today. And this was just put this into context a little bit, because next week we're going to be looking at the next chapter 12, which is already Lech Lecha. Chapter 12 is already Avram Avinu appears on the scene, right? So Chazal say that the whole Migdal Bovel story, now listen to this, is the final idea I want to share with you today. The whole Migdal Bovel story to separate mankind into different nations and different thought patterns and different ways of thinking was in order that Avram Avinu would have a chance in going around the world teaching monotheism, teaching emunah in God. If in fact the whole world was united against him, then he wouldn't have a chance at all. But because they all had different views and they had different gods and they had different allegiances, then he could come and say, look, you believe in this God. The God on the other side of the mountain, in the town, they believe in a different God. Let me tell you the real truth. The real truth is the God, the one God, the creator. But this only came possible in a world that respected diversity. In a world that respects diversity, you can find an audience for your views about emunah, for Avraham Avinu. And therefore, Migdal Bavel is in a sense the prologue to Avraham Avinu has to operate within mankind. Mankind, there had to be the Hittites and the Canaanites and the Amori and the Mitzrayim, all these different nations. They had to be different cultures, different ways of thinking, so that he could turn up and present them with something new, something different, right? That the Hittites, for example, at the beginning of Chai Sarah, they say to Abraham, Nasi Elokim Atah B'Sochenu. You are the Prince of God. They recognized him as representing a different way of thinking and a different value system. But that was only possible because they realized that within mankind there were a multitude of value systems and beliefs. And then Avram could do his job in order to teaching emunah and chesed. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. I think our time is coming up. It's always wonderful to get together with you all on a Tuesday morning. It really contains the DNA of the whole of human history. In history, all the midday society, including the Burj Tower in Dubai, right, is an exact replica of Migdal Bavel, right? Built for powers, built for reasons of wealth and power and hubris, in order to show everybody just how great we are, in order to try and dominate the world. And in that sense, these things haven't changed. These things are really fundamental to human existence and the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. Nice to see you all.
Thank you,
sorry
Rabbi.
that the internet thing is
Thank
not
you very
quite-
much.
Brilliant.
Thanks very much.
A great pleasure.
Thank you.
Nice to see and hear you all here this morning.